Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn, and I run the services at MedComms and the associated website. So information, resources, activities, and so on for people who work in and around the global MedComms community, by which I'm talking people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and so on, the associated businesses and so on. And importantly, people who are interested in learning more about our business. Maybe you want to become a medical writer or account manager or something in MedComms. So lots of information you'll find at medcommsnetworking.com. Also the associated websites. In particular, I'd point you at NetworkPharma TV, where there's now hundreds of videos, many of which have been recorded off webinars like we're doing today. Also, particularly those of you who are interested in the business and getting a job in the business, firstmedcommsjob.com is a good place to look for insights into the career opportunities. But there's much more out there. So go and have a look at medcommsnetworking.com and follow the links. Okay. Today, absolutely delighted that we've got a panel to discuss. Well, what are we discussing? It's the new GPP 2022. Some of you will be amused to be counting how many times we get the terminology wrong. Obviously, we don't call it GPP4 anymore. We call it GPP 2022. And we're particularly interested in how, or at least I'm particularly interested, I guess, in how it's opening up access or helping us open up access to patients. It's that patient angle to GPP 2022 that I'm particularly interested in. But hopefully within the presentation and so on, we're going to hear basically a little bit of context there of what GPP 2022 is all about. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helena to lead the way. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for hosting us today. Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many people who have joined us today to listen to this conversation around patient centricity in medical publications. My name's Helena Williams. I'm Head of Medical Services at CMC Connect, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by an esteemed panel. I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves, if I can get my slides to advance, and also to answer the question around what patient centricity means to them. Our panel are coming at it from different perspectives, so I think it's interesting to hear their views on what it actually means. So if I may start with you, Jamil.
Hi, well, good morning from the States. My name is Jamil Rivers. I am living with metastatic breast cancer, and I have the honor of serving as board president of METAvivor Research and Support, which is an advocacy organization and research organization focused on specifically metastatic breast cancer and improving research and outcomes and survival in metastatic breast cancer, and also serve as CEO of the Curseless Initiative, which is an advocacy organization focused on disparities in cancer for Black people. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jamil. So, and what does patient centricity mean to you? What does that term mean to you?
Well, to me, it means that patient centricity, meaning the needs of the patient specifically in order for them to thrive or manage whatever the illness is, it's focused with their experience in mind. So when you're thinking about care delivery, clinical trials, just what is that patient experience? Is it conducive of that person being able to, be able to manage their illness, be able to take advantage of all of the services and therapeutics. So meaning whatever it is that you have in mind as far as that's in development, that it's always that compass is the patient experience and the impact on them that's living with the illness that they're impacted by.
Thank you, Jamil. Over to you, Jenny.
Sure, thanks. So grateful to be here and for the invite. My name is Jenny Ghith. I'm the Senior Director of Omnichannel Strategy and Innovations for the Global Scientific Communications team at Pfizer Oncology. That's a lot of big words at 7 a.m. in the United States over here. But what that really means is that I work with the publications teams, the Congress teams, our content development and education teams to develop plans and initiatives that meet the needs of our audiences where they are. and we do work with patients, and we strive to find innovative activities and ways to work with them. But I think that, so we think about patient centricity a lot. It's a term that we put into many of our talks and meetings. But whenever I work with someone like Jamil, we've had the pleasure of doing a few activities together over the last year or two. What it means for me is that I'm humbled in learning from their experiences, and I want to really understand what they're going through as much as I can, and understand the challenges and look for ways to help them understand information that they're getting, help them meet them where they are, because they are going through a lot, and ultimately develop initiatives and materials that help us get medicines that are important to patients into their hands as appropriate, in collaboration with their physician.
Thank you, Jenny. And over to you, Caroline.
Hi, I'm Caroline Shepherd, and I'm Portfolio Director at CMC Connect, and I've been in MedComms for over 20 years, and I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this panel today. And I guess I'm representing our medical publications professionals perspective today, and I think thinking about patient centricity in medical publications, that has two facets in terms of the development of publications and incorporating patients' perspectives and how and patients' experience into developing publications of medical research, and then also thinking about considering the information needs of patients and how those where do medical publications fit into the information needs for patients.
Thank you, Caroline. It's great to hear your own different perspectives on patient centricity, and I think in terms of scientific publications, we're really thinking about how we can make sure that credible, balanced and factually correct information is made available to patients, and that information is discoverable, it's accessible and it's understandable, so that patients are able to use it to play an active role in their own care and participate in shared decision making with their healthcare providers. So I'm going to now just move on. I've got a couple of slides to share just before we get into the panel discussion itself, just as a bit of context to our discussion. This slide just pulls out some of the patient-focused elements of the Good Publication Practice guidelines that have very recently been updated. I'm sure many of you are aware. And there are three kind of key elements, I suppose, in terms of the patient-focused updates. Firstly, around publication planning, and when appropriate to involve patients in steering committees that are involved in publication planning around a particular clinical trial or program of trials, especially important for rare or chronic conditions. Secondly, authorship, and including patients, listing them as authors on publications where they meet authorship criteria, much the same as other authors that we would consider. And thirdly, around patient plain language summaries, and the fact that they should be considered for all publications, that they should be indexed and discoverable, and that of course, the language we have to pay attention to in terms of these plain language summaries, in terms of not using any promotional language, tone or style. So that's just a very quick summary of the GPP 2022 guidelines. But these guidelines kind of raised, I suppose, three key questions in our minds. Which of these patient-centered elements of GPP 2022 are already being done? And what changes could we anticipate in response to these guidelines in terms of facilitating patient centricity in medical publications specifically, and what barriers and challenges might we face as we try to do that? So we put these 3 questions to our current publications clients in a short survey, multiple choice survey. And I just wanted to share some of the findings from that survey. We had 8 respondents, so yes, it is a very small sample, but there were some interesting highlights that came out of it actually. And so in terms of the first question, we saw that all of the respondents are currently developing enhanced content for publications that are aimed at patients and lay public. But interestingly, only one of the respondents is currently working with patients as authors or reviewers on publications or enhanced content. It's good to see that 7 out of 8 of the respondents do currently have an open access policy to publications. And in regard to the second question, we also learned that many of our clients are will be targeting more publications to open access journals as a result of the GPP 2022 recommendations. That there will be a focus on greater development of enhanced content for more publications. Publication or Congress materials will be provided on publication on public repositories. And that patients will be more often included as reviewers of enhanced content, but perhaps interestingly, only one respondent talked about involving more patients as authors of enhanced content and publications. And then in regard to the barriers and challenges that we face, there were obviously a number that were highlighted, and I think one of these is concern that perhaps we are kind of veering into the direct-to-patient communication arena, that perhaps we don't understand fully what patients value in publications to be able to target or to create content that is useful to them, and that there are some challenges around journals and what they're able to offer in terms of publishing plain language summaries, providing access to lay audiences to those publications online, and also including patients in journal author guidelines. So I think there's some food for thought there, and really want to just kind of open it up now in terms of our panel discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. There are no more slides, you'll be pleased to hear. And we want to open the discussion with a couple of questions. And my first question is to you, Jenny. I think we've heard this term patient centricity being discussed in the context of the pharmaceutical industry for many years. I think it's something that we all want to be able to achieve. And certainly we see more and more companies having roles that are dedicated to this, or even departments that are dedicated to patient centricity across the industry. But in terms of scientific publications specifically, what do you think patient centricity in this context should look like, and where do you think we are at the moment?
Well, and Helena, thanks for the question. And I know we're getting a few questions in the chat as well, and we could go through those as well about the survey. But first, where are we? Well, I think that there are tremendous strides being made. That the fact that we see some guidance around involvement of patients in publications in the new GPP guidelines is significant. The fact that we have our clinical trial registries and our regulators pushing for plain language information in summaries of clinical trials is also very significant. And we even have journals who are putting forward statements about the importance of patient involvement appropriately in clinical studies. So all of those things are, I think, really significant progress. And I think we have a lot to be excited about, but we do have to, we've also all been going through a lot with the current times, right? We've all gone through a tremendous amount of change. And that is and everything's moving towards digital. So we have a huge opportunity to even do more, to pivot even further. So a lot of us are developing materials with really good intentions, right? We're involving patients in publications, but we have so much to learn from them. Are we using the right language? Are we involving them from the inception of the publication or even the study, if you think before we publish, right? Are they being involved and not tokenizing them, not involving them later in the process, because it is still also very difficult for us sometimes to do this and to make sure that we're doing it compliantly. We may have to speak with our colleagues and get some guidance in order to make sure that we're doing so appropriately, because we want to be responsible about what we're doing. So those are things we need to be mindful of in the future. There's a great question about how we guard against confirmation bias and provide balance of good and bad experiences. I think that's an excellent consideration that we should all keep in the back of our minds whenever we start to go down these sorts of journeys. Are we really thinking about what we're saying and the language and what it conveys and the tone of that? Are we working with people who have expertise in understanding how to write these publications? And are we just, and I think we should question ourselves and challenge ourselves at this time, because there is so much excitement about whether we're, making sure we're moving forward in a way that is helpful to patients. When the reason why I talk about Omnichannel a lot is because what we try to do is understand problems. Again, what are people telling us that they really need? What is needed in the papers that we're writing, in the enhanced publication materials that we're developing? In order to develop the right pieces, we need to understand what those challenges are fully. So that is extremely important. And there's a lot of misinformation out there these days, and a lot of duplicative information. So how do we make sure that we're filling a unique need and making sure that what we're developing is accessible through open access? That came up on the survey, but also that people can find it. That's a major area of focus right now. Are these enhancements, are these plain language summaries making it into the hands of the people that need them most? Are they aware that these even exist? So I think those are really important areas for us to focus on. I think we have more work to do, but it's also just a really exciting and opportune time for us to take a moment and listen and breathe and really try and understand the issues of the people that we're trying to reach as well and talk to.
Yeah, absolutely, Jenny. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the kind of point about compliance and the concern there, because we saw that being potentially a concern from the survey about, are we kind of veering into the direct to patient communication arena here? And you also mentioned, that clearly we need to make sure that we are compliant in how we do this. So I guess it's probably a particular concern with enhanced content and kind of plain language summaries, where we're creating a summary of the information and how we do that in a compliant way. How can we overcome this concern and this kind of reluctance, perhaps, to really make strides forwards in terms of the patient centricity aspect of publications. And do you think that GPP 2022 is going to help with this? Does it go far enough maybe to have an impact here?
I think it's an important step. And I think that we're navigating this together, and GPP will mean different things to different groups. It will mean different things to the agencies and our partners who are writing the content, and it will be looked at very closely by our legal and regulatory colleagues in industry. So I think everyone is looking for clarity, and if you find that GPP you still have questions, partner with your attorneys and your governance folks in your companies. If you're a medical writer and looking for more information, for example, your society's ISMAP has a tremendous effort around communicating about GPP4 as well. So, find answers to the detailed questions that you need. I think it helps me when things get hard to think about it a little bit differently. I think we have almost a responsibility to communicate as clearly, as accurately, and even as brief or as concisely, the ABCs, right, as possible. And in order to do that, these mechanisms are being put into place that are forcing us and pushing us ahead to do so. So we do have a bit of a responsibility to make efforts and to try to make content that is more accessible and easier to understand for all of our audiences, and in particular our patients.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Jenny, as well. Obviously we're here today to talk about patients, but it's actually about broadening the reach of our communications more broadly. It includes patients, but it's also others too. I really want to pull in Jamil now into this discussion, because we're so fortunate to have you with us today, and I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about what your experience was in terms of when you were a patient, and how you kind of were able to gather the information that you needed to understand your diagnosis and to understand the treatment options that were available to you then.
Yeah, when I was first diagnosed, I think initially I did not know prior to being diagnosed that breast cancer was so complicated and that there were so many different forms of breast cancer. And so to really understand what treatment options were available to me, I first went to, National Cancer Institute, just to understand, just the, terminology that I would be hearing, just so that I could have a solid understanding when my cancer team was explaining to me what treatments and what I could anticipate. And then also went to the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines in the States, just to understand what the national recommended guidance was as far as standard of care, and what that would entail. And what did I need to do in order to make sure that I was accessing the best care that's recommended in order to have, the best outcome possible, and so those were the resources that I went to first. And then of course, connecting with METAvivor Research and Support, Living Beyond Breast Cancer, Susan G. Komen, that really also helped me, where they had advocacy training for patients in order to, for us to just understand the science and what research was on the horizon. And so that really kind of catapulted me into just learning more, really in an effort to survive, because when I was diagnosed, my youngest was in kindergarten. And so I'm just thinking, let me just set out and try to learn as much as I possibly can as far as what's the best treatment, evidence-based and research-wise, for my illness.
And how did you find, how were you able to kind of take the information that you discovered and use it to kind of inform how you, the role that you played in your own care and in your own relationship with your healthcare provider?
Well, I'm wondering if, National Cancer Institute and National Comprehensive Cancer Network maybe had patients, that they presented the documentation to see if it was digestible and comprehensible.
Mm.
Because of course, when I was able to access it, it was pretty, straightforward. For a novice like myself that really only understood breast cancer as one thing, and of course didn't understand the differences initially between breast cancer and metastatic breast cancer. But once I had the materials, this was really the most important stuff that I could study now that I had this illness to tackle and deal with in my life as a mom and a wife, and wanting to be here for my family. But it was very straightforward, really. It's almost as if, okay, this is the information that's applicable to you. So understanding my particular subtype, what test and validation would I need to kind of verify and understand the treatment recommendations coming from my cancer team. But it really was digestible and comprehensible in plain language, so to speak, so that I could really understand, okay, how does this apply to me?
That's great to hear. Were scientific publications part of that, in terms of your research?
Not initially.
Yeah.
I think initially it was more so focused on the organizations and the information that was provided there. Of course, leaning in and connecting to the advocacy organizations that were specific for breast cancer. And then, of course, now I'm a new advocate and I get to, I attended the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium and also ASCO. And so that really then connected me to the journals and to the medical information and publications. And then I started working as an advocate on clinical trials, and then as an advocate for pharmaceutical companies, and as part of the research for the new treatments and development for metastatic breast cancer, for them to get that insight from patients who are impacted so that it is actually, pertinent to meeting our needs. And that's when I started to access a lot of the medical journals, which is really helpful for me because I get to have that knowledge and awareness as to the ever-changing standards. And I mean, it's so funny to me because I get to almost see it in real time as it's developing. Just recently now there's a whole new standard in metastatic breast cancer for all these new developments, but I get to see it as it's on the horizon. So I think that's really exciting for me, because the only way that we're in metastatic breast cancer in particular, we're only going to survive if the research is ongoing and constant and continuing to develop.
Yeah, such a fast moving area, and trying to keep up to date and believe that you have the latest information to work with is a challenge for sure. I just wondered what more do you think needs to be done going forwards in terms of meeting the information needs of people with cancer? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of helping to achieve a more equitable access to credible sources of information.
Well, I think absolutely that, and I understand the compliance, but I really think that patients should be able to access this information for free. I shouldn't have to have a subscription fee in order to access the information that's pertinent for me. I think that would be great. I think also working with advocacy organizations to get the information in front of patients sooner, instead of just thinking about, it's been maybe 6 months now that some of the latest information has been updated. I'm aware of that because, I'm so plugged in, but we work with a lot of patients in the MBC community, and also with earlier stage breast cancers that, they're just not privy to this information. And so finding a way to integrate this information where doctors can use it and share, it could maybe be up-to-date information that's included in medical portals that patients can access, or, just finding ways for them to be more on the receiving end. There's a ton of apps in particular, I know, and also materials. So when I think about the work that METAvivor and the Chrysalis Initiative does, we're directly engaging with patients in order, meeting them where they are. So many patients are not as involved with advocacy or plugged in. There are many that either distrust the medical arena, or they trust them to a fault, where if they are receiving substandard care or not getting the most appropriate care for their individual situation, they're unaware. And so I think just empowering patients with more information that they can access if they choose to, even if they feel overwhelmed, but just for them to get more and more. And I've now been living with metastatic breast cancer now for 4.5 years. And, I see people in different sides of the continuum. So initially I've met patients that were just completely overwhelmed, didn't want to really understand. And now, as they've received the information in doses, they're now more confident, they're more assertive, they're willing to advocate for themselves in order to make sure that their team and that accountability is there to make sure that they're getting the best care possible.
Thank you, Jamil. It's so important, everything that you do. Caroline, I want to pose a question to you from the kind of perspective of publications professionals. Hearing the valued contributions there from Jenny and from Jamil, and considering that, I guess, scientific publications are really kind of one of the building blocks, I suppose, in terms of what we create other medical communications activities on. How do you think we should be using the GPP 2022 guidelines to help to make further progress towards patient centricity in scientific publications?
I think, yeah, as you said, the GPP 22 is our first starting point in terms of guidelines, and in medical publications we are very much led by our guidelines, that's really important. So it's great that we've got these sort of key tenets that are laid out in GPP 2022. I think the aspects that they've laid out, and as you introduced, Helena, into the webinar, is from the development perspective, and how we incorporate that into the patient's involvement into publication planning itself, patients as authors and appropriately as authors. I know that's a sort of a big word in terms of appropriately. There'll be a lot of discussions about that, and we really want to ensure that patients' perspectives are included. And I'm seeing some of the Q&A there, which is a really key point. There's much as in everything. There isn't one perspective. There are many perspectives. There's diversity in patients. So I think that's a big question, from making a statement about having an aspiration of including patients as authors, about how we do that. Patients as reviewers, already doing that, and that's acknowledged in terms of the PLS part. So again, thinking about the other side of the publications is how they're received. And as we saw from the survey, publication specialists are obviously incorporating patient reviews into developing those plain language summaries for the end user, who is intended as a lay audience primarily. So I think that the key tenets are obviously there, but I think, like everything, once you make a start, there will be more questions. And I'm sure, as publications professionals, that's the work that we're going to do, as Jenny mentioned, in our organisations, ISMAP, etc. That's the dialogue that we're going to have, because we want to obviously make sure that we're applying guidelines and best practice for the industry as a whole. And there has been a starting point in clinical. Maybe we can learn from our clinical trials and research and development colleagues who have been doing this for some time. And you can say also medical publications, that's where everything starts, from the study, patient involvement in study design, patient involvement in surveys, patients' perspectives on outcomes to include in the studies, etc. So there's a whole lot to encompass. This is a great starting point, but I think there's a lot more to think about.
Yeah.
And foremost, we must include patients in all our discussions. We're talking about patient centricity, so why wouldn't we? And I think this is what's so great about the panel we've got today. It's a starting point for those conversations and learnings.
Exactly, hugely important, and yeah, just the start. We will have many more conversations to come, I'm sure. I think at this point we can start to look at some of the questions that are coming through in terms of the Q&A and open it out to all of you and the questions that you have for us. So I'm just trying to open it up.
Can I just jump in briefly? Because I don't think we've said it, and I think it's worth making the point for context. Excuse me. GPP 2022 is the first time. Sorry, if anybody doesn't know, there's a GPP 1, GPP 2, GPP 3, and we'll stumble occasionally over trying to call this GPP 4, but it's GPP 22. But it's the first time people have talked about patients being involved in this. I think I'm right in saying, although correct me if I'm wrong, the only mentions of patients in previous versions of GPP have been along the lines of make sure that we maintain patient anonymity and so on, confidentiality. This is the first time we've sort of gone, and they should be involved in the process. And I just think that's worth making the point. And I just wondered whether anyone else had any brief reflection on how long it's taken us to get to that point.
I mean,
Jenny,
so GPP, yeah, so GPP is a really important step, and it is. I saw a comment in the chat. It gives you something tangible to start from, right? This is publications, and I think. For Jamil, when I listened to her talk, you know, there have been efforts by patient groups predating GPP, and even by, for example, the European Clinical Trials Register for more incorporation of lay summaries, for even bringing patient advocates into medical meetings. You know, groups like SABCS and ASCO in oncology have done that. ACR, which is a rheumatology organization, has a CME program where they bring patients in. And now we're even seeing patient poster pilots at some organizations as well in the GU space. So there has been movement. I think GPP4 is really important because it gives us something tangible from a publication standpoint and from a plain language summary standpoint. But there is certainly more work to be done, and we have more interest in this. We've actually done some quantitative work looking at the emergence of the patient voice in publications, and you're not necessarily seeing huge upward trends yet, right? But I think we're all at a really important potential pivot point.
Sorry,
thanks for the question, Peter.
I just want to dive in there slightly, and because there's a couple of different directions, and I don't want to start going too far down the wrong direction here. But one of the points that I think is important to make here again also is that there is a tendency to mix up the terminology a little bit. Yeah, so the sort of patient summaries that are being required of the clinical trial registries is a different issue, really, isn't it? And what we're talking about here is you talk about plain language summaries in the context of publications and GPP 2022 and so on.
Absolutely.
And I think Helena or somebody made the point, and it is an important point. Plain language summaries are not just for patients, they're just to broaden the audience. So there are different levels you can talk about here. And if we're talking about opening access to patients specifically, which is sort of the context of this, then the plain language summary doesn't necessarily answer that problem. You know, there's an argument, say, you know, there's got to be another level and so on. The enhancements and so on don't necessarily, none of this actually necessarily answers the problem. I mean, but it's going in the right direction. And one of the points, and again, I'll just make the point because we're in Open Access Week 2022, you know, open access to information is almost the fundamental point about all of this. GPP 2022 is recommending that open access is followed, but we're a long way away from widely accessibly open access accessibly information, yeah. And I was curious, I don't know how far we can go with this, and I'm going to start, but Jamil, this is where I'm interested in you a little bit. You know, it's open access, you know, and what can you actually get hold of, yeah, is really important. But Helen, I think you said something like 7 out of 8 of your clients said that they had open access policies. I'm only aware of a couple of companies that have basically said everything has to be open access, and I just wondered whether you could reflect for a moment on how far those companies are going with their open access policies and what you're seeing at a wider level, because I think from where I sit, a lot of companies are not going that far, but I may just be ignorant. So could you just reflect on that point specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's the limitation of the survey in the sense it was a multiple choice question rather than free text answers. So we don't have kind of details as such that, you know, it was an anonymized survey. But I'm sure Caroline can chip in terms of kind of the clients that we work with closely and their kind of open access policies in that regard.
I would say that there has been an increasing trend over the years. I mean, it's not necessary. I think in that respect for GPP 2022 is acknowledging that, and I think there is an increasing trend to have open access across the board for publications. But I can't speak for obviously for individual clients, but I can speak of trends. I think that is the case.
So are we agreeing the trend is in the right direction, but we've still got a long way to go? And we're dodging the numbers here a little bit.
And I would love to obviously have Jamil's comment as the you know an end user on that. But open access is about making the publications available, but without being behind a firewall. But then there are the whole other aspect of how interpreting a publication, how accessible is it in terms of the language, the interpretation, and what it gives. And then of course we've got our plain language summaries, which again, we're making progress on, you know, GPP 2020 said all publications should have plain language summaries. So that's another aspect as well in terms of accessibility of the content and the information and the ability to interpret that. There's another question mark about, and again, I'll let Jamil come in here, but in terms of the plain language summaries themselves, how do patients value those themselves? I know there have been some researchers at ISMAP and professional meetings looking into that, but for me, that's another, you know, big unanswered question that we must, you know, work more and delve into.
Jamil, go on, jump in on that point then.
Yeah, I can say that I definitely appreciate the lay terminology and the plain language summaries. It really helps to get to the nitty-gritty, if you will. Okay, what is the bottom line? What are the results? And so I do appreciate that. And then just thinking about the past 4.5 years and understanding, you know, the type of cancer that I have and the treatments that are relevant to it, and the information that, as far as just the management of my disease, there's so much that I've learned that I've been able to bring back to my cancer team and ask about and inquire about, that's now incorporated in my care. And so I just think about, well, what if I did not know or have this information? But because of that, I've been able to make sure that I have the most robust, comprehensive care, even beyond what I think my cancer team is aware of and accessible to. And just thinking about how this is also impactful to just patients across the country. So I think of one woman that we help in Mississippi who in order for her to access what we consider to be an academic center, so a high level institution, the closest one to her is about 600 miles from her home, but she has access to in this digital age, us being able to connect her with these resources, with this information, being able to get virtual second opinions with her information. And now she's getting this high level standard of care, but it's being implemented by her local community hospital, which initially when she was diagnosed, they were not giving the level of treatment and level of diagnosis as far as the diagnostic workup. But because she advocated for herself and had the information to show them, to say, hey, I really need to get this level of testing done in order to get just better visibility as to the characteristics of my cancer. And now this testing is indicating that I would have a better durable response to this treatment as an alternative instead of the one that you initially gave me. And now she's actually had more stability and less progression in her disease because of that. And so I do think it is that equalizer when we think about equity, just having access to this information. And if we didn't, I just think about, well, man, you could be alive, but you would not be thriving and having as great a quality of life if you aren't getting that therapeutics and treatment based off of what's the best as far as the research and innovation shows.
Okay, and it's and I think an important part about this is it's opening up access to information is it's in a very broad sense. And some people would argue, well, nobody's going to go and read these papers or whatever. Why worry about making them open access? And the majority of people, I think you said, Jamil, people can choose to. That's the important point. And at the moment, an awful lot of people can't choose to read the information because it's behind paywalls and so on, or it's not presented in appropriate ways. And it may be that patient advocates and so on is absolutely the way it works. So, specialists, advocates, whatever, spend that bit more time, they can access the information, they can interpret it for the wider audience. But it starts with making the information available. And then also those other patients don't go, well, the only reason Jamil knows about this is because she's part of some secret club or something, and therefore I'm suspicious of that. Actually, the information is there. I think this basic, I totally believe in open access. I'm quite excited about it. And I just think there's a very fundamental rightness about open access information to enable a lot of what you've been talking about. Just to come, we're going to run out of time in a minute, and I just want to come back to the GPP 22 and the patient involvement. And we're talking about involving them in publications, planning committees, and so on. Very important. It seems to me when I read GPP 22 that it's about, well, we can involve patients in a planning committee. They can be an author if they meet criteria and all the rest of it. I don't actually think that's a very complicated question. If they meet the criteria, then they're an author, and if they don't, sort of thing. But maybe I'm oversimplifying it there. I just wonder a little bit how much real experience there is, and again, maybe a comment from a couple of you, of actually getting patients involved. Jamil, have you been a patient author? Have you been on a publications planning committee? Just give me a sense of whether this is just a few words that says we can do it, or whether as an industry we're actually doing it, even if we're at an early stage at the moment. Just a couple of moments reflection on that from a couple of you.
I definitely see more invitations to provide input and insight in order to be included as a patient author, which I think anytime when I think if it's patient-centric, I think also whatever is being revealed and publicized for patients to access, that patient insight, even if they're not included as an author for the material that's being published, if patients can review it and provide their insight as well, that can also be helpful. But I think the patient perspective has to be included, not just in the how are they going to receive the information, but also making sure that that content from the patient perspective is also included. So I think that's a great way to make sure that that is actually being met, to include patients as authors in these publications.
I think
I'm going to pin you down. Helena, how many are we actually doing that though, or are we just talking about it? Just give me a sense what you think, Helena. Is the industry doing that?
I think it varies.
Okay,
I think it's a variable thing at the moment, isn't it? And I think that's kind of what we are seeing. We are seeing progress, I think, in the right direction, but it's it takes time for it to filter through. So Jenny, you can probably add to that in terms of your experience of kind of how these things are applied.
Yeah, so we are doing it, Peter. I wouldn't say it's pervasive. So we absolutely have patients on steering committees. We have patients who we're working with and engaging as authors. I think it's a bit spotty right now and continues to be spotty. There are training programs in patient authorship now. There are even some grants that are emerging out there to help encourage this as well. And some centers of excellence are even working towards this in academia. The NCI and the NIH are doing workshops and inviting patients to their workshops, which is awesome, right? So is it happening? Yes. Is it increasing? I've got some quantitative data that suggests, well, we're trying, but it's not really like moving as fast as we'd like it to.
Okay. That's as far as I'm going to push that one. I think there's an important message in there somewhere, and I guess we all get that message, and maybe in a year's time we can talk about how much more progress we've made and so on. And I did, and again, I need to wrap this up. It was interesting with GPP 2022. And it was picked up in some of the discussion that's gone alongside of that article. You know, we're talking about involving patients, but actually there weren't, as far as we can work out, any patients actually involved in the development of the GPP 22 guidelines. And there is a GPP working party which is talking about involving all stakeholders, but frankly noticeably doesn't mention the patients. And yes, I know the intent is there, but I think it's right that people keep pushing away at it and going, well, the intent and whatever is one thing, you've got to make it happen, and you've got to see those words coming through. So I suppose from a personal point of view, simply an interested observer, I guess, in all this, I think it's quite clear we're going in the right direction, but we've been going in the right direction for a long time. We spent a few years talking about this sort of stuff, and yes, it's good to know we're going in the right direction, but let's keep going. And things like GPP 22 is very useful, but it could go a lot further, particularly in this one aspect of involving patients, because it does give you those guidelines and that sort of incentive to sort of keep going. So anyway, okay, right, look, go on. Sorry, who was that? Sorry,
that was just me. One final point, Peter, and I think it relates to some of the questions that we've had, but also to a point that Jamil made earlier, that it's not just about having patients as authors, and not even just about having patients as part of a steering committee or whatever. It's everything that we do to gather insights from patients and incorporate those into what we create. So even if they're not an author, we can still understand the patient perspective. We can still feed that into the work that we do in medical communications.
Absolutely. And to go further than that, touching on what some of the questions are aimed at, it's more than the publications community or medical communications community about. It's about the whole process, trials and all the rest of it. So that there's a whole wide
world out there.
Yeah. And we are, at the end of the day, and the problem with something like this is we're sort of focused on one tiny little bit of it, trying also to grapple with a much wider perspective. But look, I think we are over time, but I thought some of that was absolutely fascinating. I'd like to draw a line. I'd like to say a huge thank you to you guys, also to the audience for joining in. Thank you very much. I do know you're all happy for me to say please, and part of the point of these webinars is people make connections and so on. So please, everybody, follow up, make connections, and reach out to the panelists and talk about these issues. And hopefully this is part of a much wider discussion going on at places like we've mentioned in the comments about ISMA and their meetings and so on and so forth. There's lots of talk about this, and everyone should just be more engaged. That's what I sort of hope, basically. So thank you to you guys for joining us today. Thank you to the audience. I'm going to ask you all to just give a little wave as I stop the recording. Members of the audience, don't rush away. We've got a couple of minutes. We can carry on talking. But thank you to you guys for the moment. So a little wave. Bye-bye. Take care. Cheers.